The committee is meeting today to review the state of current Coast Guard missions, manpower, resources, acquisitions, and budgetary needs. And I'm honored to be here with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. This is my first hearing as the chairman of the subcommittee with my colleague and friend Senator Peters as the ranking member, and I look forward to working with him and members of both sides of the aisle here, I think, on an issue that's very bipartisan, and that's the U.S. Coast Guard. As you know, Admiral Zukov, our main witness today, I certainly have a great appreciation for the work the Coast Guard does in Alaska and for the country, and it's an honor to have you here, and it's an honor for you to represent the men and women of the Coast Guard, and please pass on to them the appreciation from this committee and the exceptional work that they're doing. Maritime security and safety are issues of national security and are essential to economic prosperity. Global stability is dependent on safe and unfettered access to the maritime domain. Congress has given the Coast Guard a wide range of missions, from search and rescue, icebreaking, and marine environmental protection, to port security, drug interdiction, international crisis response, and readiness to support the Department of Defense in its operations. With such an integral role in national security and global stability, it should not be overlooked by members of this committee or by the Trump administration that the Coast Guard is the fifth branch of the armed services. By securing our maritime border, the Coast Guard acts as the front line of defense for our homeland. The Coast Guard combats transnational criminal organizations at the points of using cutters and resources to intercept drugs and human smugglers off foreign shores prior to threats even getting close to our shores. The Coast Guard supports U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that is why today I would like members of this committee, many of whom I also serve with on the Armed Services Committee, to think about these issues as much as you would from a Commerce Committee perspective, as well as an Armed Services Committee perspective. As the Coast Guard balances the wide range of public safety, stewardship, and national security missions, these missions do not remain static. Challenges for the Coast Guard, threats to our nation, are emerging, whether those are terrorism, drug trafficking in the Caribbean Basin in Central America. Overseas contingency operations continually demand more of the Coast Guard. The mission requirements are also expanding in my home state of Alaska. The area of responsibility assigned to Coast Guard units within Alaska's waters is the largest in the nation, encompassing an area over 3.5 million square miles. We have a little map, the blue, and the Great Lakes, of course, Senator Peters, are indicative of what the Coast Guard has to cover. And that is a lot of territory. There's heightened interest in the Arctic with the region's future, resource development, increased transportation, maritime traffic, resource development, fisheries management. Just comment on, as you know, just in 2010, the Panamanian flag shipping vessel, the Nordic Barents, sailed through the northern sea route from Norway to China. It saved almost 18 days from the normal Suez Canal route, and that's $300,000 just in fuel savings. Since then, there has been a continuous and increasing amount of activity in the Arctic and the northern sea route. Just this past summer, the cruise ship Crystal Serenity, with more than 1,700 passengers on board, became the largest commercial cruise ship ever to navigate the Northwest Passage from Alaska over to New York. And America is lagging behind other countries when it comes to our ability to protect U.S. interests in the Arctic. I will have questions for you, sir, on what the Russians are doing in the Arctic and what we are trying to do there. I also want to make sure we talk about the assets of the Coast Guard. The National Security Cutter, the NSC, will be an asset in the Arctic region, but also throughout the country, as it has proven its operations in other theaters. The expanded capabilities of the NSC have had dramatic results in our fight against transnational criminal organizations in the drug transit zones of the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. The Coast Guard cutter Hamilton secured 26 metric tons of cocaine worth over $760 million just on its maiden voyage. I look forward to its continued success and continued delivery of all 9 of these high-performance vessels. As has been reported in the pre-decisional funding guidance we heard from OMB during formation of the President's budget contained a significant proposed cut in the Coast Guard. A number of us worked together, Senator Cantwell, myself, several other members of this committee, to address this to OMB and let them know what we thought of the importance of fully funding the Coast Guard. Ultimately, the proposed budget provides the discretion to the Department of Homeland Security to allocate its department-wide budget in a manner of its choosing, and I'm confident that Secretary Kelly, sorry about that, will be a strong supporter of the Coast Guard given his previous position as the commander of Southern Command. This subcommittee has a great deal of work to do to ensure that the Coast Guard is properly resourced to fund its priorities, modernize its assets, and successfully execute its mission. Admiral, we look forward to your testimony. I hope this hearing is able to focus attention on the mission demands placed upon the Coast Guard and the value the service provides to the national security, national defense, and homeland security and prosperity of this nation. Thank you. Thank you, Admiral. And again, thanks for your service, and please pass on our appreciation to all the men and women in the Coast Guard who do such an exceptional job every day. I wanted to follow up on what you mentioned just in your testimony and also in your State of the Coast Guard address last week when you talked about the need to look at the budget of the Coast Guard to be no longer marked as discretionary non-defense. And can you explain a little bit more in detail on your ideas on how to focus this issue? You're clearly one of the 5 services. You serve on the Joint Chiefs, isn't that correct? That is correct. And yet, somehow, maybe because you're not located over at the Pentagon, there seems to be an occasional disconnect. And I think it comes from the Congress, but I also think it comes from the executive branch. How can we better address the issue that you are a key member of the U.S. military that a number of us want to make sure we're rebuilding, all 5 services?
So it's a binary approach. We have non-defense discretionary and defense discretionary. In our defense discretionary, that comprises 4% of the Coast Guard's budget. The other 96% is non-defense discretionary. It would be helpful if I gave you an example. Today we have over 18 ships that are chopped to Southern Command. No Navy ships. That fleet down there are all Coast Guard ships. Bought for and paid for by the Coast Guard with non-defense discretionary, manned with non-defense discretionary, operated and maintained with non-defense discretionary funding.
And who has operational control over there? Is that the combatant commander of Southern Command?
They're under the tactical command of Southern Command, doing detection and monitoring activities, which is considered a defense or Title X authority. But as soon as it transitions to an interdiction law enforcement operation, these very same people, very same platforms shift to doing Title 14, which is law enforcement authority. So we have our feet in both buckets, in enforcing law and upholding sovereignty across the world. The Coast Guard is off the coast of 6 of 7 continents right now, and we can do this interchangeably. But 96% of our budget finds itself in non-defense discretionary when, in fact, we are a very fungible service that on a daily basis works across these defense and non-defense authorities to carry out missions in support of our national security.
So when the Trump administration talks about increasing spending for national defense in terms of our military and in terms of our homeland security, you would seem to be in your service occupy both fields.
And we would certainly like to be included, as we mentioned, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine, let's not forget the Coast Guard as we talk about readiness concerns of our armed service, because we are, in fact, an armed service, first and foremost.
I want to change topics, Admiral. The fishing industry is important to a number of the members in the committee here. What do you see right now as the biggest challenges, whether in Alaska or off the coast of Mississippi or New Jersey, with regard to our fishing fleet? Is it IUU issues? What are the biggest challenges that the Coast Guard is focused on right now?
I first look at this globally, and about 3 billion people today in the world, out of 7.2 billion people, reside on fish as their primary source of protein. If I look out 20 years from now, the world's population is going to be closing in on $9 billion, and many of these fish stocks are already collapsing. Chairman, as you well know, we have a very sustainable fishery in Alaska, up in the Bering Sea. We don't know where fish are going to go, but we do know that ocean temperatures are warming and fish are moving further and further north, and we have a moratorium up in the high latitudes that say you can't fish up here, but we don't have an enforcement mechanism. So as I look at global demands for fish and protein and distant water fishing fleets, we can't just put paper on top of this and say no fishing allowed. It does require an enforcement regime, and we need to look at how do we sustain fisheries where it works. And right now, the model that works the best with individual fishing quotas, our work with NOAA and the fishery councils, that is a model of success. We do have stressors elsewhere, particularly off the coast of New England. But I look at where the largest fish stocks are drawn from in this country is in the state of Alaska and those waters adjacent there too.
Let me, I'm going to end the hearing with a few additional questions. I wanted to, as you and I have discussed previously, there's been some concerns in the Alaska fishing fleet about the Alternative Safety Compliance Program. And I just want to get your continued commitment to work with me and my office and the members of our fishing community on that. As you know, that's been a troubling kind of overhang for a number of owners of our vessels, and the Coast Guard has it's been slow to kind of get some of the regs out. We took up some legislation this last Congress to kind of push that out further. But can I get your commitment on continuing to work with that? That is something that I want to make sure. We all want safety, but at the same time, a number of my constituents have had concerns with that, and we've had good cooperation with you. I just want to continue that.
Senator, yeah, and this really begins with stakeholder engagement, and whether it's alternative planning criteria, as you have mentioned. Another issue that we had talked about before were guides operating in remote regions. We just recently, again, listening to your constituents, consolidated all of those 9 regions into one. So you don't need familiarization in 9 different regions to hold a charter license. So again, all of that done through stakeholder engagement, and we will do the same with alternative planning criteria as well.
Right. I want to go back to the Arctic. You know, I think you're seeing a theme here on the icebreakers and the need, whether in the Great Lakes, whether in the Arctic. There's been a lot of interest. I also serve on the Armed Services Committee. A lot of interest with regard to our strategy there. Have you read the recent Department of Defense strategy that was produced just a couple months ago on updated Arctic strategy?
Senator, I have, and I just read, which was released today from the Council of Foreign Relations, the work of the Arctic Task Force. And so I really find a lot, near-term relevancy in the work created by the Arctic Task Force, but I have read both of these documents.
So I asked this in an Armed Services hearing recently. One of the elements of that new strategy is to conduct to look at our strategic interests in the Arctic, be it resource development, be it fisheries, be it protecting the environment, be it increase vessel traffic, all of which is happening. Talking about the ability to conduct fawn ops, you think we have the ability to conduct freedom of navigation operations in a way commensurate, say, with the Russians if they were trying to shut down the shipping lanes in that part of the world?
We have a good model to begin with Canada. They make the same claim with the Northwest Passage. our key ally, Canada. Might we be able to approach this rather than forcing freedom of navigation, but maybe multilaterally or bilaterally that would provide United States access through these waters? We might want to look at a different model, but my biggest concern right now is the 386,000 square miles that the Coast Guard has mapped, our extended continental shelf, half of the 30% of the world's natural gas, half of the 13% of the unexploited oil that we hear about is in the Arctic, is actually in our EEZ and in our extended continental shelf, 50% of those reserves. But right now, we have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. We do not have a mechanism, if you will, where we can lay claim to what is clearly our extended continental shelf at a point in time where Russia is now declaring a good portion of the Arctic Ocean all the way up to the North Pole. So if we are not up there operating, if we're not up there looking out for our sovereign interests, which means we're thereby standing on the sidelines. But those are two of my immediate concerns. But I would like to at least approach freedom of navigation diplomatically first, and not as a show of force initially.
Okay, but it does mention in the new DoD strategy to be ready to have the capacity to conduct those, if need be.
Yes, sir.
My concern, particularly given what you just mentioned about the icebreakers and essentially only having one, is that we don't have that capacity. I think it's very clear that we don't have that capacity. So that's going to be a focus of mine to make sure that we're working to enable us to be able to do that. Another thing that came out of the NDAA recently was, just this last NDAA, was the requirement both from the Secretary of Defense in conjunction with the Secretary of Homeland Security for the designation of what's called a strategic Arctic port. And that is something that we certainly want the Coast Guard to be part of. But if you can look at that, the deadline for that report for the initial designation is June 21st, 2017. That's just 3 months away. So I wanted to highlight that for you, and I know that that's something we're going to be following very closely, both from this committee's perspective and jurisdiction, and also from the Armed Services jurisdiction. Can I get your commitment to work with the Secretary, both of Defense and Homeland Security, on that legal requirement from the last NDAA?
Senator, we are. In fact, we're already working, that's been delegated down to Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, and you're very familiar with the draft work that the Army Corps has completed. We're very familiar with that as well. I'm confident we'll be able to make this deadline.
Great, thank you. Just following up on Senator Schatz's comment, when he said just re-looking at mission orientation, given our assets, given the lack of icebreakers that we have and the need, whether it's up off the coast of Alaska or in the Great Lakes near Michigan, does it make sense to have a Coast Guard, a heavy icebreaker, go down to Antarctica every year?
We have strategic interest in the Arctic. We're part of that treaty. I don't know what China's intentions are long-term in Antarctica. There is a provision to do no exploitation work, but what is that going to look like 20, 30 years from now? But if we are not a player down there, then we are an observer. And this is not the point in time. I think it's in our best interest to be, distant virtual observers and not key participants in upholding the treaty in Antarctica.
Let me just conclude my questioning in the hearing with the poster board here that I began with, and you mentioned it. This is actually from a Coast Guard slide. Some of your staff were good enough to show this to me recently, but as you noted, Admiral, the United States EEZs 13 separate areas spread across 9 time zones. You see everything from Alaska, which I think is your biggest one, certainly, but a whole host of areas, Hawaii, the Great Lakes. If we're successful and can budget the completion of the acquisition of 9 national security cutters, 58 fast response cutters, and 24 offshore patrol cutters. Does that give you enough assets to conduct the mission that, let's face it, that's about a quarter of the entire globe right there on that map? Do you have enough assets to do the job in those areas?
So,
You have a very broad mission
yeah, well, we have
base.
one more, so it's 25 offshore patrol cutters, but not that that would be the tipping point. I can't project what that world's going to look like in 20 years. But in 20 years, we will have built out this fleet of 25 offshore patrol cutters. In fact, that entire fleet will be fully operational and capable. What is the role of transnational criminal organizations? What is our role with China? What is the role of Russia? We were called to send cutters over to the Mediterranean. We still face the biggest flow of refugees in the world. There could be other nations that fail in this hemisphere, and we see a mass migration. So it is critical if you have what I call a hot production line, where you're already pulling ships off that product line. In fact, when we build our 7th national security cutter, the Kimball, that will christen in Hawaii next year, that's going to cost less than the 4th national security cutter. The 9th national security cutter will cost less than the 7th. So there's an advantage if you have a hot product line and then the world around you has changed. You can do that at a very affordable cost rather than going on a hiatus and then think you can jumpstart a program where you suddenly realize you need more capacity. So in the next decade, as these product lines start to build out, we need to look at the world again. Where is the Navy? Is the Navy going to have 355 ships? Or do they count some of our ships towards their 355? Are those some of the strategic dialogues we need to have, not just with this committee, but obviously with House and Senate Armed Services Committee as well going forward in terms of what is the right fleet mix for our nation as we look at global maritime threats?
Well, thank you very much for that comment, and I can assure you as a chairman here, and I think I can speak for the ranking member, and both of us serve on the Armed Services Committee as well, that we want to work closely with you and your team on these critical issues. We also want to work closely with you on the deployment and stationing of these vessels where it makes the most strategic sense. If you look at that map, I certainly think there's a lot of strategic sense to cover more of that territory up in Alaska with the increasing traffic and increasing strategic interest. But we look forward to working with you on all of these issues, Admiral, and again, appreciate your service and those of the entire Coast Guard. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.